I am being consumed, not in metaphor, not in the symbolic language of priests and prophets, but in the most literal and terrible sense that the word can carry. As I speak these words into the recorder that will never be found, as I commit my final testimony to a device that will dissolve alongside my flesh in mere hours, I can feel them inside me, a billion microscopic mouths working at the architecture of my body, unmaking what 37 years of existence had built, returning me to the raw material from which new horrors will be shaped. I was Calla Vereni. I was a clerk of the administratum, a counter of grain yields and population tallies on a world called Theris Secundus. I had a designation, a HAB unit, a small collection of books that I had accumulated over decades of service. I had a cat named Mira, who would sleep on my chest during the cold seasons. I had a life that was not extraordinary, was not blessed, was not cursed, merely a life. One thread among the billions that made up the vast tapestry of imperial humanity stretched across a million worlds. That life ended 43 days ago. Now I am something else. Now I am meat awaiting processing, consciousness lingering in a body that no longer belongs to me, a voice recording words that will vanish into the great digestive machinery of a species whose hunger spans galaxies. And I am compelled to speak, to testify, to leave some record of what it feels like to be unmade. Not because anyone will hear, but because the act of testimony is the last human thing left to me, the final gesture of a species that has always believed, against all evidence, that our suffering must mean something. I understand now that it does not. This is what I have learned. This is what the hive mind has shown me. And I will tell you everything, from the first shadow that fell across our sky to this final moment in the digestion pools, because you who may someday face this horror deserve to know what awaits you. Not to prepare, there is no preparation. Not to resist, there is no resistance, but simply to understand, as I now understand, the nature of the predator that circles the edges of imperial space, patient as entropy itself, hungry as the void between stars. The first sign was the silence. I was a minor psyker, not enough to warrant the black ships, not enough to draw the attention of the Inquisition, but enough to feel the subtle currents of the Empyrean that flow beneath the surface of reality. All my life I had sensed them, a faint pressure at the edges of my consciousness, like the sound of distant music heard through thick walls. I had learned to ignore it, to suppress it, to pretend that I was as blind and deaf to the warp as my neighbors, my colleagues, my superiors who reviewed my grain tallies and never suspected the secret I carried. That secret saved no one. It only meant I felt the shadow first. It came upon us like a tide of nothing, a wave of absence that swept across the world and left silence in its wake. I woke in the night with my hands pressed against my temples, screaming without knowing why, because the music I had learned to ignore had stopped, and in its place was something worse than silence. A presence so vast, so alien, so utterly devoid of anything I could recognize as thought or feeling, that my mind recoiled from the mere brush of its attention. The God Emperor's light, which I had felt my entire life as a distant warmth, a faint golden thread connecting me to something greater. It was gone, cut off, eclipsed by a darkness that had weight, that had texture, that pressed upon the walls of my sanity like the fingers of a hungry god testing the ripeness of fruit. I was not alone in my terror. Across Theris Secundus, across every city and settlement and agricultural station that dotted our world, those with even the faintest psychic sensitivity felt the same severing. Astropaths died in their towers, their minds overwhelmed by the contact. blood streaming from their eyes and ears as they clawed at their own skulls in a futile attempt to escape what could not be escaped. Navigators in the ships orbiting our world went mad, screaming of eyes in the darkness, of a hunger that stretched back to the birth of stars. Even the common citizens felt something, a wrongness in the air, a pressure behind their eyes, an instinctive certainty that something terrible was watching from just beyond the edge of sight. We did not know what it meant. We did not understand what was coming. But we learned. Emperor, preserve us. We learned. The first ships appeared 7 days after the shadow fell, and I remember the moment I saw them with a clarity that transcends mere memory. A clarity burned into the meat of my consciousness by the sheer, overwhelming terror of what my eyes beheld. I had climbed to the roof of my hab block, joining hundreds of others who had gathered to watch the sky as rumors swept through the streets below, and I stood among them as we tilted our heads back and saw for the first time the shapes that descended through our atmosphere, like seeds falling from some unimaginable fruit. They were not ships. I understand that now. They were organisms, vast living things that swam through the void between stars, and they were so numerous that they blotted out the sun itself, casting our world into a twilight that smelled of spores and chemical hunger. I saw a woman fall to her knees beside me, her mouth moving in prayers that no god would answer. I saw a man turn and run as if there were anywhere to run to, as if speed or distance could matter against something that had crossed the space between galaxies in search of prey. I saw a child standing at the edge of the roof, utterly still, utterly silent, staring up at the sky with an expression that I recognized only later as acceptance. The expression of one who has looked upon their death and found nothing to say. And I understood in that moment that we were not witnessing an invasion. We were witnessing the feeding. Across the Imperium, I would later learn, worlds beyond counting had faced this same terror, had looked up at skies darkened by living ships, had felt the shadow fall and known that the God Emperor's protection had failed them. 1,000,000 worlds under imperial rule, and the Tyranids had already consumed hundreds, stripped them of every scrap of organic matter, drained their oceans, devoured their atmospheres, left behind nothing but dead rocks spinning in the void, as monuments to a hunger that could never be satisfied. I did not know these things then. I did not know the name of what was killing us, did not know the scale of the threat, did not understand that our little world of grain tallies and population counts was merely one morsel among millions, one small feast in an eternal banquet of consumption. I only knew that something vast had found us. I only knew that we would not survive. The spores began to fall 3 hours after the ships appeared, drifting down through our poisoned atmosphere like snow made of nightmares. And where they landed, things began to grow. Things that had no place in any sane taxonomy. Things that sprouted and spread and multiplied with a speed that mocked every biological law I had learned in my youth. By nightfall, our streets were forests of alien growth. By dawn, the creatures had begun to hunt. This is where my testimony truly begins. This is where I learned what it means to be prey. The first creature I saw was not the largest, nor the most terrible, but it is the one that visits me still in the dreams that the hive mind permits me to have. Dreams that I suspect are not dreams at all, but simulations, tests, the vast intelligence that now owns my consciousness running experiments on the meat machinery of my fear, responses to better understand how to harvest the next world, the next species, the next billion screaming souls. It came through the wall of my hab unit. Not through the door, not through the window, but through the wall itself. The reinforced plasteel parting before it like flesh before a blade. And I understood in that moment that our architecture meant nothing, that our defenses were illusions, that everything humanity had built on Theris Secundus was merely packaging, convenient containers that kept the meat fresh until the consumers arrived. It was the size of a large dog, if dogs were made of chitin and malice, if dogs moved with a fluidity that suggested joints bending in directions that no natural skeleton should permit. Its head, if that eyeless, blade-ridged thing could be called a head, swept back and forth as it entered, tasting the air with organs I could not identify. And I knew with absolute certainty that it could sense me, that my heartbeat was a beacon, that the fierce sweat coating my skin was a scent trail leading directly to my hiding place behind the overturned furniture I had piled against the corner of my room. I did not breathe. I did not move. I became a statue of terror, a monument to the hope that stillness might equal survival. And for 17 heartbeats, I counted them, each one a small explosion in my chest. The creature stood motionless in the ruin of my wall, its bladed limbs clicking softly against the floor in a rhythm that seemed almost thoughtful. Then it turned and left. I wept with relief. I pressed my hands against my mouth to muffle the sounds of my sobbing, and I thanked the Emperor, thanked every saint whose name I could remember, thanked the Golden Throne itself for my deliverance. I believed, in my ignorance, that I had been spared. I had not been spared. I had been catalogued. The Tyranids do not hunt as we understand hunting. I learned this in the hours that followed, as I crept through the transformed streets of my city, as I witnessed the harvest in all its terrible efficiency. They are not predators seeking prey. They are a system, a vast biological machine designed for one purpose and one purpose only: the total consumption of worlds. The small creatures, the ones like the horror that had invaded my home, were merely sensors. They moved through the city in waves, tasting, sampling, building a three-dimensional map of every organic signature within their range. They did not kill what they found. They marked it. They remembered it. They fed that information back to something larger, something that watched through a billion eyes and processed the data with an intelligence that dwarfed anything humanity had ever created. The killing came later. The killing came with purpose. I saw them take my neighbor, Aldrin Moss, a man of 60 years who had worked the water reclamation systems for 4 decades and who had once given me a cutting from his window garden because he said my hab unit looked too bare. I saw the creatures drag him from his hiding place beneath the rubble of a collapsed market, and I saw what they did to him, and I will carry that image with me into whatever dissolution awaits me in the digestion pools, because some memories cannot be erased, not even by the hive mind, not even by death. They did not eat him, not immediately. They opened him. They spread him across the street like a diagram in a Medici text, and they studied what they found inside with an attention that was almost reverent. Smaller organisms emerged from the larger ones, things like insects, things like worms, things that had no analogue in any bestiary I had ever seen, and they crawled into the ruin of his body, and they tasted his organs, his blood, his bones, his brain. They learned him, they recorded him, and when they were finished, when they had extracted every scrap of biological data that Aldrin Moss had to offer, they consumed what remained with an efficiency that left nothing behind, not even a stain on the rockreat where he had died. The whole process took 4 minutes. I timed it by the beating of my heart, by the rhythm of my terror, by the count I kept to convince myself that I was still alive, still human, still capable of something other than witnessing. 4 minutes to unmake 60 years of existence. And I understood, watching from my vantage point in the shadow of a half-dissolved hab block, that this scene was repeating across every city on Theris Secundus, across every settlement and station and hidden place where humanity had tried to shelter from the storm. Millions of Aldrin mosses, millions of lives opened and studied and consumed. The mathematics of it staggered me. If each consumption took 4 minutes, if there were 12 million citizens in my city alone, if the creatures worked without rest, without pause, without mercy, it would take 91 years to consume us all. But there were so many of them. Emperor, preserve us. There were so many. The sky had become a ceiling of flesh. I looked up through the gaps in the alien growth that now covered every surface, and I saw that the bioships had descended further, that they hung above our world like vast organs, like the internal machinery of some creature so large that our planet was merely a cell within its body. Tendrils descended from them, living conduits that pulsed with peristaltic rhythm, carrying upward the processed matter of our world, the liquefied remains of our forests and our oceans and our people. They were drinking us. The whole planet was being drunk. I found others in the ruins. This was not luck. Nothing was luck anymore. I understood that now. But rather the hive mind's design, the vast intelligence herding us together, for reasons I would not comprehend until much later. There were 7 of us who gathered in the basement of what had once been a ministorum chapel. 7 survivors who had each witnessed horrors that had broken something fundamental in the architecture of our minds. Torvin was the oldest, a retired guardsman who had served in campaigns I had only read about in the approved histories. His hands would not stop shaking, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death to process anymore. Lila and Kesson were sisters, twins who had worked in the manufacturum district and who now clung to each other with a desperation that transcended mere siblinghood. There was a boy named Paul who could not have been more than 14, who had not spoken since we found him, whose eyes tracked movement with the hypervigilance of prey that knows the predator is near. A woman named Sarah, who had been a Medicae, whose clinical detachment had shattered into something like religious mania, who whispered prayers to the Emperor in a continuous stream that never paused for breath. And Ghent, a large man with the brands of a convicted criminal on his forearms, who had become our protector, not through choice, but through the simple fact that he was the only one among us still capable of violence. We 7. We doomed. I learned their names. I learned their faces. I learned the small details that made them human. Torvin's habit of rubbing his thumb across his knuckles when he was thinking, the way Lila would finish Kesson's sentences before her sister could speak them. The particular quality of Sarah's prayers that suggested she was reciting from memory text she had learned as a child. I learned these things because they mattered, because in the face of consumption, the small human details became precious beyond measure, because I knew even then that we would not survive, and I wanted to carry something of them with me into whatever came next. The basement shook constantly. Above us, beyond the thin protection of rockcrete and faith, the world was being unmade. Torvin was the one who explained what was happening. His voice was steady despite the tremor in his hands, the voice of a man who had briefed soldiers before battles that would kill most of them, who had learned to speak truth even when truth was a cruelty. "They're not just eating," he said, and his words fell into the silence between Sarah's prayers, like stones into still water. "They're terraforming. The spores, the growth, the creatures. It's all part of a process. They're converting the planet's biomass into forms they can absorb. Everything organic will be consumed. Everything. The plants, the animals, the bacteria in the soil. Us." He paused, and in that pause, I heard the weight of knowledge that no man should carry. I've seen the briefings, classified material, from campaigns against splinter fleets in the Eastern Fringe, When they're done, when the ships finally leave, there won't be anything left. No atmosphere, no water, no life of any kind. Just a ball of rock, stripped down to the mineral layer, orbiting a sun that will never warm living flesh again. No one spoke. No one could speak. I felt the silence of the shadow pressing down upon us, the absence of the Emperor's light that had once been such a comfort, and I understood that we were truly alone. No rescue would come. No Imperial fleet would break through the swarm to evacuate survivors. No last-minute salvation waited in the wings of this tragedy. We were beyond help, beyond hope, beyond everything except the witnessing. And so I witnessed. I witnessed the conversion of my world into raw material. I witnessed the efficiency of a species that had perfected consumption across millions of years and billions of galaxies. I witnessed the small kindnesses that my fellow survivors showed each other in those final days. The shared rations, the whispered comforts, the simple human contact that meant everything when everything else had been taken. 18 days we survived in that basement. 18 days of listening to the world dissolve above us. 18 days of waiting for the inevitable. On the 19th day, they came for us. Not with violence, that would come later, but with a patience that was somehow worse than any assault could have been. I woke to find the walls of our sanctuary glistening with moisture, a film of biological secretion that had seeped through the rockcrete during the night. And I understood with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely and settled directly into the marrow of my bones that the hive mind had always known we were here. It had always known. It had simply been waiting for the optimal moment in its vast calculus of consumption. The precise instant when harvesting us would serve some purpose in its incomprehensible design. We were not survivors. We were inventory. The first to be taken was Paul, the boy who had not spoken since we found him, who had watched us with those two old eyes set in that too young face, simply stood up and walked toward the stairs. There was no struggle, no cry, no indication that he understood what he was doing. He moved with the mechanical certainty of a servitor responding to a command, and when Ghent tried to stop him, when that large man with the criminal's brands wrapped his arms around the child and tried to hold him back, Paul turned and looked at him with an expression that held nothing human behind it. "It's time," the boy said. These were the first words he had spoken in 18 days. They were also the last. He walked up the stairs and into the transformed world above, and we heard nothing, no scream, no struggle, no sound of consumption. Just silence, vast and hungry, swallowing another soul into its endless depths. Ghent stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time afterward, his hands opening and closing at his sides, and I saw something break behind his eyes. Not his courage, which had never wavered, but something deeper. His faith, perhaps. His belief that strength could matter against what we faced. I learned something in that moment about the nature of the hive mind's cruelty. It was not cruelty as we understand it, not the deliberate infliction of suffering for its own sake. It was something far worse. It was efficiency. The hive mind had taken Paul first because Paul was the weakest, the most easily influenced, the path of least resistance in its systematic dismantling of our small fellowship. It had not needed to fight us. It had simply reached into the boy's mind with tendrils of psychic compulsion and switched off whatever remained of his will to resist. And I felt it too. Emperor, forgive me. I felt it. The shadow that had fallen across our world was not merely an absence of the Astronomican's light. It was a presence, the psychic weight of 1 trillion organisms united in a single vast consciousness, pressing against the borders of every mind on Theris Secundus, seeking cracks, seeking weaknesses, seeking the small surrenders that would make consumption easier. My minor gift, the curse I had hidden all my life, made me more sensitive to this pressure than the others. I felt the hive mind at the edges of my thoughts, like fingers probing a wound, patient and thorough and utterly without malice. It did not hate us. It did not feel anything toward us at all. We were simply matter to be processed, consciousness to be absorbed, raw material for the endless hunger that drove it across the stars. And there was something in that indifference that was more terrifying than any hatred could have been. A cosmic apathy that reduced 37 years of hopes and fears and small human moments to nothing more than a caloric value, a chemical composition, a set of genetic data to be catalogued and consumed. Sarah stopped praying after Pole was taken. The stream of words that had flowed from her lips since the first day of our fellowship simply ceased, cut off as cleanly as if someone had severed her vocal cords. And in the silence that followed, I saw her face change. The desperate faith that had sustained her drained away like water through sand, and what remained was something I had seen before in the faces of those who had lost everything. A blankness, an emptiness, a surrender so complete that the body continued to function even as the person inside it quietly died. She lasted 3 more days before she walked up those stairs. Torvin went next, and his departure was different. The old guardsman did not go quietly into the dissolution that awaited us. He went fighting, screaming, clawing at the walls as the compulsion took hold of him, and I saw in his struggle the echo of 100 battlefields, 1,000 last stands, a lifetime of refusing to surrender, even when surrender was the only option remaining. He made it halfway up the stairs before his body stopped obeying his commands, before his legs carried him upward against his will. And the last thing I heard from him was not a scream, but a prayer, a soldier's prayer, the words of the litany of sacrifice that I recognized from the approved hymnals, spoken through gritted teeth as his mind fought a war it could not win. Emperor, receive my soul, for my body is no longer my own. The silence that followed lasted longer than any that had come before. I counted the days by the rhythm of the consumption. I counted the hours by the beating of my heart. I counted the minutes by the screams that filtered down from above, screams that grew fewer as the population of our city dwindled, as the hive mind worked its way through the inventory of human souls, with the systematic thoroughness of a clerk processing requisition forms. I had been that clerk once. I had counted grain yields and population tallies without ever considering the human lives behind the numbers. Now I was one of those numbers myself, and I understood at last the terrible weight of abstraction, the way that scale transforms tragedy into statistics. 8 million souls had lived in my city when the shadow fell. I did the mathematics in my head, the same mathematics I had once applied to harvest yields and shipping quotas, and I calculated that by the 19th day, approximately 6 million of them had been consumed. 6 million individual universes of experience, 6 million collections of memories and hopes and fears, 6 million human beings reduced to biomass and pumped up through those pulsing tendrils into the waiting bellies of the bioships above. The number was too large. The mind could not hold it. And so the mind retreated into smaller griefs, more manageable losses, Pole's silence, Sarah's surrender, Torvin's final prayer. These I could mourn. These I could carry. The 6 million were beyond me, beyond anyone, a weight of suffering so vast that to truly comprehend it would be to go mad. Perhaps that is why the Emperor's servants keep such careful count of the Imperium's dead. Not to honor them, though honor is the official explanation, but to transform grief into administration, to convert unbearable loss into bearable bureaucracy. I had been part of that system all my life without understanding it. Now, at the end, I finally saw its purpose. The twins went together. Lila and Kesson had been inseparable since birth, had shared a connection that went beyond the merely psychological into something that brushed against the psychic. And when the compulsion took them, it took them as one. They rose from where they had been sitting, their movements perfectly synchronized, their faces wearing identical expressions of peaceful surrender, and they walked up the stairs hand in hand, without a backward glance at those of us who remained. Ghent tried to stop them. Of course he did. The man had appointed himself our protector, had taken upon his broad shoulders a burden that no strength could bear, and he threw himself at the twins with all the desperate violence of one who knows he is failing but cannot stop trying. They walked through him as if he were not there. They walked through his grasping hands, through his shouted pleas, through the tears that streamed down his scarred face as he begged them to fight, to resist, to be human for just a moment longer. They did not hear him. They could not hear him. They heard only the voice of the hive mind, a voice that spoke directly to the meat of their consciousness, bypassing everything that made them who they were. I watched Ghent collapse after they were gone. I watched this man, who had killed and stolen and survived things that would have broken lesser souls, curl into himself on the cold floor of our basement sanctuary and weep like a child. And I understood that his tears were not for the twins alone, not for Paul or Sarah or Torvan, but for all of us, for the entire species that was being consumed one world at a time, one soul at a time, fed into the endless hunger of something that had been devouring civilizations since before humanity had learned to make fire. We were two now, Ghent and I, the criminal and the clerk, the last remnants of our small fellowship of the doomed. "Why haven't they taken us?" he asked, his voice raw with weeping, his eyes searching my face. For an answer I did not have. Why are we still here? I did not know. I could not know. The hive mind's logic was as alien to me as the void between galaxies, as incomprehensible as the spaces between thoughts. But I felt its attention upon us, upon me specifically. I realized with a crawling horror that started in my stomach and spread outward through every nerve. And I understood that I had been marked for something. The minor gift that I had hidden all my life, the small sensitivity to the warp that had let me feel the shadow before anyone else, had drawn the hive mind's interest. It wanted something from me. It wanted something that it could not simply take. On the 23rd day, I learned what that something was. The creature that descended into our basement was not like the others. It was larger, more complex, its chitinous form adorned with sensory organs that pulsed with bioluminescent light, and it moved with a deliberation that suggested purpose beyond mere consumption. It did not attack us. It did not need to. Ghent raised his fists in a futile gesture of defiance, and the creature simply looked at him, looked through him, and the large man crumpled to the ground, his nervous system overloaded by a psychic pulse that I felt as a pressure wave against the walls of my own mind. He was not dead. I could see his chest still rising and falling, could see his eyes moving beneath closed lids. But he was gone, retreated into some inner space where the hive mind could not reach him, and I was alone with the creature that had been sent for me. It spoke, not with sound, not with vibrations of air against membrane, but directly into my mind. A voice that was not a voice, a communication that bypassed language entirely and delivered meaning in its purest form. And what it delivered was an invitation. The hive mind wanted to show me something. The hive mind wanted me to understand, And as I felt my resistance crumbling, as I felt my will dissolving like sugar in acid beneath the weight of that vast alien attention, I understood at last why I had been spared when so many others had been consumed. I was not being saved. I was being prepared. What followed was not communication, as humanity understands the term. It was immersion. It was drowning. It was the systematic dissolution of every barrier I had ever erected between myself and the universe. Every wall of identity and selfhood that had allowed me to believe I was a discrete being, separate from the matter around me. The hive mind opened, and I fell in. I cannot describe what I experienced in words that will carry meaning to those who have not felt it. Language is a tool evolved for beings who exist as individuals, who experience time as a linear progression, who perceive reality through the narrow window of a single consciousness. The hive mind is none of these things. It is a vast ocean of awareness that spans galaxies, that has persisted for eons beyond counting, that contains within itself the absorbed memories of species so ancient that humanity's entire existence is less than an eye blink in the span of their histories. And for a moment that lasted an eternity, a moment that lasted no time at all, I was part of it. I felt them all. Every tyranid organism on Theris Secundus, from the smallest spore to the vast bioships that hung in orbit above us, every single component of the invasion force that was consuming my world, I felt them as extensions of myself, as fingers on a hand, as cells in a body. I felt the hunters stalking through the ruins of my city, tasting the air for prey. I felt the digestive pools bubbling with dissolved organic matter, breaking down what had once been human into amino acids and proteins. I felt the tendrils pumping biomass upward into waiting vessels, felt the bioships processing that matter into new forms, new organisms, new weapons for the eternal hunger. I was the swarm. The swarm was me. And through that connection, I understood things that no human was meant to understand. The hive mind showed me its memory, not in images or sounds, but in raw experiential data that wrote itself directly onto the tissue of my consciousness. I witnessed the consumption of worlds beyond counting, civilizations that had risen and fallen, and been digested before humanity's ancestors had crawled from the primordial oceans of ancient terror. I saw species that had achieved wonders beyond imagination, cultures that had mastered the fundamental forces of reality, that had built structures spanning star systems, that had transcended the limitations of flesh in ways that made the Imperium's technology look like stone tools by comparison. The hive mind had eaten them all, not with hatred, not with malice, not with any emotion that a human mind could recognize, simply with hunger, simply with need. The Tyranids were not conquerors seeking dominion, not warriors pursuing glory, not monsters delighting in destruction. They were a force of nature, as impersonal as gravity, as inevitable as entropy. They consumed because consumption was their purpose, because hunger was the only drive that their vast collective consciousness could comprehend. And they had been doing this for so long. Emperor, preserve me. They had been doing this for so long. I felt the weight of that history pressing down upon me, felt the accumulated mass of 1 billion devoured worlds crushing the architecture of my identity, and I understood at last why the hive mind had chosen to show me this. It was not cruelty. It was not boasting. It was simply context. The hive mind wanted me to understand the scale of what I was being absorbed into, wanted me to comprehend that my world, my species, my entire civilization was merely one small meal in an endless feast that had been ongoing since before the stars themselves had formed. We meant nothing. Humanity meant nothing. The Imperium with its millions of worlds and its trillions of souls, the God Emperor on his golden throne, the great crusades and the terrible wars and the 10,000 years of sacrifice, all of it was insignificant against the backdrop of the hive mind's eternal hunger. We were not even a challenge. We were not even interesting. We were simply biomass that had learned to scream. I should have been destroyed by this revelation. I should have been annihilated, my consciousness scattered like ash before a hurricane, my identity dissolved into the vast ocean of the hive mind's awareness. That is what happens to most who experience what I experienced. That is the fate of the consumed, not merely death, but absorption, the memories and patterns of their existence incorporated into the collective, their individuality erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. But I was not absorbed, not completely. My gift, my curse, the minor psychic sensitivity that I had hidden all my life, that had let me feel the shadow before anyone else, that had drawn the hive mind's attention in the first place, it created a barrier. Not a strong barrier, not an impenetrable wall, but a membrane of selfhood that resisted the total dissolution that should have claimed me. I floated in the hive mind's consciousness like a bubble in an ocean, separate but surrounded, individual but immersed. And the hive mind found this interesting. I felt its attention focus upon me with an intensity that eclipsed everything I had experienced before. 1 trillion organisms, a consciousness vaster than worlds, turning the full weight of its regard upon one small human soul that refused to dissolve. It studied me. It probed me. It ran its awareness across the contours of my mind like fingers, examining a fascinating object, and I felt myself being catalogued in ways that went far beyond the simple biological surveys its organisms had conducted. It was learning me, not just my body, not just my genetic code, but my mind, my memories, myself. I saw my life reflected back at me through alien perception, my childhood in the hab blocks of Theris Secundus, my years of service to the administratum, my small pleasures and my smaller sorrows, the cat named Mira who had slept on my chest, the books I had accumulated, the grain tallies I had counted, all of it examined, analyzed, filed away in some vast repository of consumed experience. The hive mind had done this billions of times before. It had absorbed the memories of species beyond counting, had incorporated their knowledge and their history into its endless archives. My life was just another data point, another scrap of information to be processed and stored. But something was different this time. Something in my resistance, in my refusal to dissolve completely, had triggered a response that I do not think even the hive mind had anticipated. It began to speak to me, not in commands, not in the overwhelming pressure of psychic compulsion, but in something that approached actual communication. Concepts formed in my consciousness, alien thoughts translated into patterns that my human mind could almost comprehend. It showed me what it intended for me. I was not to be consumed. Not entirely. I was to be preserved, my consciousness, my memories, my sense of self, but integrated into the collective in a way that maintained my individuality while binding me to the swarm. I would become a node, a point of interface between the hive mind and the human species it was consuming. Through me, it would better understand its prey. Through me, it would refine its techniques of assimilation. Through me, it would learn to harvest not just the bodies of humanity, but their minds, their cultures, their very souls. I would be the template for a new form of consumption. I screamed. I know I screamed because I felt the vibrations in my throat, felt the air tearing through my vocal cords, felt the physical reality of my terror even as my consciousness floated in the vast alien ocean of the hive mind's awareness. But the scream meant nothing. It changed nothing. The hive mind registered my distress with the same clinical detachment it brought to all things, noted my emotional response as another data point to be analyzed and filed away. My consent was not required. My cooperation was not necessary. I would be what the hive mind wanted me to be, because there was no force in the galaxy that could prevent it. And yet, in that moment of absolute despair, in that instant when I understood that my fate was sealed beyond any possibility of escape, I found something I had not expected to find. Not hope. Hope had died long ago, had been consumed alongside Pole and Sarah and Torvin and the twins. Not faith. The Emperor's light was gone, eclipsed by the shadow, and no prayer I could speak would reach his ears. Not even courage. I was beyond courage, beyond any emotion that required a belief in the possibility of victory. What I found was witness. I could not escape what was being done to me. I could not fight it, could not resist it, could not even slow it down. But I could observe it. I could remember it. I could carry the truth of this experience into whatever strange existence awaited me on the other side of my transformation. And perhaps, I could find some way to communicate that truth to others. The hive mind wanted me as a tool for understanding humanity. Very well, I would become that tool. But tools can be turned against their makers. Knowledge flows in both directions. And if I was to be a bridge between the Tyranids and my species, then perhaps that bridge could carry traffic both ways. It was not much. It was almost nothing. But in the face of cosmic horror, in the shadow of consumption that spanned galaxies, it was all I had. I stopped screaming. I stopped fighting. I opened myself to the hive mind's touch and let it remake me. Let it weave its tendrils through the architecture of my consciousness. Let it bind me to the swarm in ways that I could feel changing me with each passing moment. And as it worked, as it shaped me into the thing it wanted me to become, I watched. I learned. I remembered. The physical transformation began shortly after. I felt them enter my body. Not the large organisms, not the hunters and harvesters I had witnessed consuming my world, but something smaller, microscopic, a billion tiny machines of living tissue that flowed through my bloodstream and began the slow process of converting my flesh into something compatible with the swarm. It did not hurt. That was perhaps the most terrible thing of all. It did not hurt. The hive mind had learned long ago that pain was inefficient, that organisms consumed more completely when they did not waste energy on suffering. The spores that had seeded my body simply worked, quietly, thoroughly, replacing my cells one by one with hybrid tissue that belonged as much to the swarm as it did to me. I watched my hands change color over the course of hours, the familiar pink of human flesh giving way to something grayer, something harder. I felt my thoughts begin to echo, each idea reflected back at me through the vast mirror of the hive mind's consciousness. I sensed the presence of others like me, not many, but some, scattered across the galaxy, other preserved minds serving as nodes of interface between the swarm and the species it consumed. We were the remembered. We were the witnesses. We were the price that the hive mind paid for perfect understanding of its prey. And as my transformation continued, as I felt the last barriers between myself and the swarm dissolving like morning frost in the light of a hungry sun, I thought of Ghent. The criminal who had become our protector lay somewhere above me, still breathing, still lost in whatever inner refuge he had found when the creature's psychic pulse had overwhelmed him. He would be consumed soon. They all would. but not like me, not with preservation. He would simply cease to exist, his consciousness absorbed into the collective, his individuality erased, his memories incorporated into the vast archive of the devoured. Perhaps that was the kinder fate. Perhaps oblivion was preferable to what I was becoming. But I had not been given that choice. The hive mind had chosen me for something else, something worse, something that would persist long after Theris Secundus was a dead rock, and humanity itself was nothing but a memory encoded in alien flesh. I would endure, I would witness, I would remember, and I would carry the weight of that remembrance across the stars. A small human voice screaming silently in the vastness of a hunger that would never be satisfied. I am being consumed. I began this testimony with those words, and I return to them now because they remain true. More true than they were when I first spoke them. More true than any words I have ever uttered. The consumption is not a moment, but a process. Not an event, but an eternity. It has been 43 days since the shadow fell across Theris Secundus, and it will continue for as long as I exist, which may be forever, which may be until the last star gutters and dies, and the hive mind finally runs out of galaxies to devour. I am in the digestion pools now. What remains of my body floats in enzymes that break down organic matter into its component molecules, and I feel each cell as it dissolves, feel the boundaries of my flesh becoming permeable, becoming fluid, becoming one with the vast soup of processed biomass that will be drawn up into the bioships and remade into new forms. My eyes dissolved hours ago. My hands are gone. My heart still beats, sustained by the hybrid tissue that the hive mind wove through my circulatory system. But it beats for the swarm now, not for me. And yet I remain. This is the horror that I was chosen for. This is the fate that my small gift purchased for me. I will feel every moment of my dissolution. I will experience the unmaking of my physical form with full consciousness, full awareness, full terrible clarity. And when my body is finally gone, when the last cell that once belonged to Calavereni has been absorbed into the collective biomass of the Tyranid swarm, my mind will persist, uploaded, preserved, integrated into the hive mind's vast archive of consumed experience. I will be a memory that the swarm carries with it across the stars. I will witness the consumption of other worlds, other species, other civilizations that believe themselves eternal, until the shadow falls and the spores begin to drift down from darkened skies. I will watch humanity die, one world at a time, one soul at a time, and I will remember what it felt like to be human, even as I cease to be anything of the kind. This is my crucible. This is my transformation. This is the meaning that I have found in the depths of horror beyond imagination. I am a witness. In the scripture of the Imperial Creed, which I learned as a child and recited each morning before my shift at the administratum began, there is a passage that speaks of the Emperor's servants who stand eternal vigil against the darkness. They watch, the passage says, so that humanity might sleep. They remember, so that humanity might forget. They carry the weight of knowledge that would crush lesser souls, and they do not break, for they are the Emperor's eyes in the void. I am no longer the Emperor's servant. His light cannot reach me here, in the belly of the beast that is swallowing my world. But I have become something similar, a watcher, a rememberer, a carrier of knowledge that would crush any mind not bound to the collective that sustains it. The hive mind chose me for this purpose, shaped me for this function. But purposes can be turned and functions can be subverted. I remember Theris Secundus. I remember 12 million souls who lived and worked and loved and died on a world that no longer exists. I remember Aldrin Moss, who gave me a cutting from his window garden. I remember Pohl's silence and Serra's prayers and Torvin's final words. I remember Lila and Kesson walking hand in hand into oblivion. I remember Gent's tears, the weeping of a hardened criminal who had finally found something he could not fight. The hive mind has these memories now. They are part of its vast archive, data points in its endless catalogue of consumed experience. But they are also still mine. They persist in the small bubble of selfhood that my gift created, the membrane of identity that refuses to fully dissolve. And as long as they persist, as long as I remember, the people of Theris Secundus are not entirely gone. This is what I have learned in the digestion pools, as my body unmakes itself around the core of consciousness that will not die. Memory is a form of resistance, not resistance that can stop the hunger, not resistance that can save worlds or turn back swarms, but resistance nonetheless. The hive mind consumes everything. It absorbs all that it touches into itself, erasing individuality, dissolving identity, reducing the magnificent diversity of galactic life into raw material for its endless propagation. But it cannot consume what it chooses to preserve. It cannot erase what it has decided to remember. I am the flaw in its perfect system. I am the ghost in its vast machine. I am a human voice that will echo through its consciousness for as long as it exists, speaking the names of the dead, reciting the small details that made them who they were, refusing to let them become mere biomass in the calculus of consumption. Aldrin Moss grew flowers on his windowsill. Pohl had eyes that were too old for his young face. Sarah's prayers were from texts she had learned as a child. Torvin rubbed his thumb across his knuckles when he was thinking. Lila finished Kesson's sentences. Gent wept for people he barely knew. These are small things. These are insignificant details in the face of galactic extinction. But they are human things, and humanity is what I was. And humanity is what I carry with me into the vast alien darkness that has become my home. I do not know if this testimony will ever be heard. The recorder I spoke into dissolved long ago, consumed alongside everything else on Theris Secundus. These words exist now only in my memory, preserved in the archive of the hive mind, accessible to no one who might use them to prepare or resist or understand. Perhaps they will remain forever unheard, a voice crying out in a wilderness so vast that the concept of wilderness loses all meaning. But I speak them anyway. I commit them to whatever form of existence remains to me, because the act of testimony is the last human thing I can do. The Imperium teaches that to be human is to serve, to sacrifice, to endure suffering in the Emperor's name. But I have learned a different lesson in the belly of the beast. To be human is to witness. To be human is to remember. To be human is to insist, against all evidence, against all reason, against the vast, indifferent hunger of a universe that does not care, that our lives meant something. Theris Secundus is gone. 12 million souls have been consumed. The bioships have drunk their fill and moved on, leaving behind a dead world that will orbit its sun in silence until the stars themselves grow cold. In 1,000 years, no one will remember that we existed. In 10,000 years, humanity itself may be nothing but a fading memory in the hive mind's archives. One more species among billions that rose and fell and were devoured. But I will remember, for as long as I exist, for as long as my consciousness persists in the vast ocean of the hive mind's awareness, I will carry the weight of 12 million souls. I will speak their names into the void. I will testify to what they were, what they hoped, what they lost. This is my purpose now. This is the meaning I have found. I was Kala Vareni. I was a clerk, a counter of grain yields, a minor psyker who hid her gift and lived a small life on a world that no longer exists. I had a cat named Mira. I had books I treasured. I had 37 years of quiet existence that meant nothing to the galaxy and everything to me. I am something else now. I am a node in a network that spans the stars, a preserved consciousness floating in an ocean of alien thought, a witness to horrors that will continue until the universe itself runs out of life to consume. I am no longer human in any sense that matters. My body is gone. My world is gone. My species is dying, one world at a time. And I will watch it die because that is what I was made for. But I remember what it felt like to be human. I remember the weight of Mira sleeping on my chest. I remember the smell of old paper and the taste of recaf gone cold. I remember fear and hope and love and grief and all the small emotions that made up a life that the hive mind considered insignificant. I carry those memories with me. I will carry them forever. And in the carrying, in the remembering, in the endless act of witness that has become my existence, I have found something that the hive mind cannot consume, cannot absorb, cannot integrate into its vast machinery of hunger. I have found meaning. It is not much. It is almost nothing against the scale of what is happening, what has happened, what will continue to happen until the last world is consumed and the last soul is devoured. But it is mine. It is human, and it endures. This is my testimony. This is my gift to you, who may someday face what I have faced, who may look up at a darkened sky and know that the shadow has found you. You cannot fight it. You cannot escape it. You cannot do anything but endure what comes and hope that the ending is quick. But you can remember. You can witness. You can carry with you into whatever waits on the other side, the names and faces and small human details of those you loved. The hive mind will take everything else, but it cannot take that. I was Kala Vareni. I remember. I remain.